The dinner rush at Auberge Champlain had not yet peaked when the Maître D noticed the police officer moving through the foyer, like a man who had already decided how the evening would end. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of evening in Ottawa, when the sky turns the colour of old pewter and the St. Lawrence wind cuts through even the finest wool coat. Inside the restaurant, however, the atmosphere was exactly what it had been for 43 years, warm, unhurried, and quietly expensive. The kind of place where federal cabinet ministers entertained foreign dignitaries, where Supreme Court justices celebrated retirements, and where the wine list ran to 14 pages. The kind of place where a reservation required 6 weeks' notice and a certain understanding of how things were done. Captain Adisa Mensah-Oduya had been waiting 20 minutes for his guest when the trouble began. Sat alone, at table 7, the corner booth near the east window that the staff quietly reserved for guests of particular distinction. At 44, Mensah-Oduya carried himself of a man who had learned long ago that composure was not a luxury but a survival skill. He was broad-shouldered and immaculate in a charcoal blazer over a pale blue shirt, no tie, the top button open, a deliberate concession to civilian life that he hadn't yet fully made peace with. His hands rested flat on the white linen tablecloth. A glass of sparkling water sat untouched to his right. The bread basket had not been touched either. He was, by every visible measure, a man simply waiting for his dinner companion. What the other diners could not see, what Officer Dale Kovacs could not see, and would not have cared about if he could, was the small matter of who Captain Adisa Mensah-Oduya actually was. 3 months earlier, Mensah-Oduya had returned from his third deployment to Mali as part of Canada's contribution to the United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission. Before that, he had spent 18 months embedded with NATO forces in Latvia, and before that, 2 years as a liaison officer at Canadian Forces Station Alert, the most remote, permanently inhabited outpost on Earth. The Canadian Armed Forces had sent him to places that didn't appear on civilian maps for reasons that were never fully explained to anyone outside a certain level of clearance. He had been wounded twice. He had 2 commendations for valor, and a third still working its way through the paperwork. His service record, if printed, ran to 63 pages. Tonight's dinner was to celebrate something considerably quieter. His daughter had just been accepted to the Royal Military College in Kingston. The first person in their family's Canadian history to do so, his guest, Colonel Bernadette Tremblay-Ninkosi, his former commanding officer, and the closest thing he had to a mentor, had insisted on marking the occasion somewhere that matched the gravity of it. Officer Dale Kovacs had never heard of Adisa Mensah-Oduya. He had never heard of MINUSMA, or CFS Alert, or the particular kind of patience that gets built into a person after years of operating in environments where a wrong move meant bodies. What Kovacs had heard, 40 minutes earlier, was a radio dispatch about a break-and-enter at a jewelry boutique, 4 blocks East Spark Street. The suspect, a black male, adult, wearing dark clothing, last seen on foot heading west. That was the entirety of the description. Dark clothing, west. Kovacs drove 3 blocks past the actual direction of travel, parked on a hydrant in front of Auberge Champlain, and walked inside. The maitre d', a meticulous man named Henri whose family had worked in Ottawa hospitality for 2 generations, stepped forward immediately. "Good evening, officer. Can I be of assistance?" Kovacs barely glanced at him. Police business. He was already scanning the dining room, his jaw set, his right thumb hooked into his duty belt, with a studied casualness that was, in reality, anything but casual. His eyes moved over the tables, the older couples, the business dinners, the small celebrations, and stopped. Corner table, black man, dark jacket. Kovacs crossed the room. He didn't walk the way a person walks when they're uncertain of their footing. He walked the way a person walks when they've already rehearsed the scene in their head and cast themselves as the authority in it. Several diners looked up. A woman in a red dress near the bar quietly set down her wine glass. Mensah-Oduya had noticed Kovacs the moment he entered the restaurant. It was not a conscious observation so much as a reflex, the kind of peripheral threat assessment that 12 years of military service had made involuntary. He watched the officer's approach in the faint reflection of the darkened window glass beside him. He noted the posture, the trajectory, the locked jaw. He placed his water glass on the tablecloth with great care, straightened slightly in his seat and waited. "Excuse me." Kovacs stopped at the edge of the table, feet planted wide. "I need to see some ID." Mensah-Oduya looked up. His expression was neutral in a way that required active work to maintain. "Good evening," he said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "ID. Now. May I ask what this is regarding?" "We have a report of a break-and-enter in the area. You match the description of a suspect." Kovacs leaned slightly forward, a posture calibrated to occupy space, to compress the other person. "I'm going to need to see your identification." Mensah-Oduya did not move for a long moment. Around them, the nearest tables had gone quiet, conversations suspended mid-sentence. A waiter stood frozen near the service station, tray in hand. "I've been seated at this table for approximately 25 minutes, Mensah-Oduya said, his voice carrying the flat, unruffled quality of a man accustomed to maintaining verbal precision under pressure. "The staff can confirm my arrival time. I've ordered water, and I'm waiting for my guest. I haven't been near Spark Street this evening." Kovacs's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I asked you. I asked for your ID, and I'm asking you to clarify the legal basis for this request. Am I being detained?" The question landed in the air between them like something thrown. Kovacs felt the heat move up the back of his neck. In his experience, that particular question, "Am I being detained?" only came from people who were trying to make his job difficult. People who thought knowing a phrase or two from a legal rights pamphlet made them untouchable. He had developed a personal and visceral dislike for the question over his 9 years on the force, and hearing it delivered in that particular tone, that quiet, immovable tone, made his jaw clench. "You match the description of a suspect in an active investigation," he said, the words coming out harder than he intended. "That gives me reasonable grounds to ask for your identification." "Now I'm asking you once more. A description of a black man in dark clothing in a city of 1 million people," Mensah-Oduya replied. "Still quiet, is not a description, it is a demographic, and it does not constitute reasonable grounds for a detention under the Charter." He paused. "I'm going to ask you once more, am I being detained?" Kovacs stepped closer. The edge of his boot pressed against the base of the table, close enough that the cutlery shifted slightly on the linen. "You're being obstructive," he said. "And I'm telling you right now, if you don't produce identification, I am going to conclude this encounter very differently than you want it to conclude. Then I need you to tell me, explicitly, that I am being detained," Mensah-Oduya said, "and I need you to articulate the reasonable grounds." There were 12 people within earshot at that point. Several of them were already holding phones below the table's edge, screens tilted upward. Kovacs unclipped his handcuffs. The sound of the snap was loud in the quiet restaurant, a small mechanical violence that cut through the ambient murmur of the room and silenced it completely. "Stand up," Kovacs said. "You're being detained pending investigation. If you resist, I'll be adding obstruction to the list." Mensah-Oduya did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Kovacs with an expression that was not anger and not fear, but something more unsettling. The look of a person who has already calculated how this ends and is simply waiting for events to confirm the calculation. "I want to be clear," he said softly, "that I am not resisting anything. I am asserting my legal rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Whatever you do next is entirely your decision and yours alone." Kovacs reached for his arm. He never made contact. "Officer." The voice came from behind him, not shouted. It did not need to be either of those things, because it was the kind of voice that had been built over 4 decades to carry across parade squares in February wind and briefing rooms where generals sat. It was a voice that had given orders on 3 continents and had never once had to repeat itself. Kovacs turned. Colonel Bernadette Tremblay-Nkosi had arrived. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in a deep burgundy coat over a charcoal suit. She stood just inside the archway from the lobby, and she had clearly been there long enough to have watched the entire exchange unfold. In her left hand, she held a small leather portfolio. On the lapel of her blazer, barely visible in the amber light, was a small gold pin, the crossed sword and baton of a full colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces, framed beneath the maple leaf. Kovacs looked at her. He opened his mouth. "Do not speak yet," Tremblay-Nkosi said, walking forward. Her pace was unhurried, almost leisurely, the pace of someone who has never once in her adult life needed to rush to assert authority. She stopped beside Kovacs, close enough that he had to turn his head to look at her. "I want you to think very carefully before you say anything, because what you say in the next 30 seconds is going to determine the remainder of your career." The handcuffs were still in Kovacs' hand. He suddenly seemed aware of them in a way he hadn't been a moment ago. "I am Colonel Bernadette Tremblay-Nkosi," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the nearest 4 tables. "Deputy Commander, 2 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group. The man you have just attempted to detain is Captain Adisa Mensah-Oduya, a decorated officer of the Canadian Armed Forces, with 3 operational deployments, 2 commendations for valor, and a service record that would make your personnel file look like a parking ticket. He has been seated at this table for 26 minutes. I know this because I was watching him through the lobby window when I arrived, and I have been standing in that archway for the last 4 minutes watching you bully him." She tilted her head slightly. "So, what exactly would you like to say?" The room was completely, utterly silent. Kovacs's face had gone the color of old concrete. The handcuffs were trembling slightly. Not from aggression now, but from something else entirely. His eyes moved from Tremblay-Nkosi to Mensah-Oduya, who had still not changed his expression, who was still sitting with both hands visible on the tablecloth, watching Kovacs with that same level, measuring gaze. There was a dispatch," Kovacs started. "A, B and E on Spark Street. The suspect description." "The suspect description," Tremblay-Nkosi repeated, "that you are currently using to justify placing hands on a federal officer in a restaurant where he has a confirmed reservation, where the staff can verify his arrival time, and where he has done nothing more threatening than assert his constitutional rights." She let the question sit. "Clip those handcuffs back on your belt." Kovacs's hand moved automatically. The cuffs went back. The snap of the clip was quieter this time, smaller. "I'm going to make a phone call now," Tremblay-Nkosi said, opening her leather portfolio and removing a slim government phone. "I am going to call Staff Sergeant Lynn Chartrand, who is your shift supervisor tonight. Then, depending on how the next few minutes go, I am going to decide whether I also call the Ottawa Police Service's Professional Standards Unit, the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, and the duty officer at the Judge Advocate General's branch, because what you just attempted to do to a serving member of the Canadian Armed Forces has implications that go considerably beyond a departmental reprimand." She looked at Kovacs steadily. "Stand there and don't move." She made the first call in under 90 seconds. She did not raise her voice. She stated the situation in 4 sentences, gave the address, gave Kovacs's badge number, which she had read off his uniform when she walked in, and said that a supervisor was needed immediately and without sirens. Mensah-Oduya, during this, had reached for his water glass. He took a slow drink, set the glass down, and looked at the bread basket. He took a piece of bread, broke it in half, and ate one half with the measured calm of a man who has decided that nothing happening in this room is going to disrupt his appetite. It was, somehow, the most devastating thing he could have done. Kovacs stood beside the table and said nothing for 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which 3 different diners quietly recorded him on their phones, during which Henri the maitre stationed himself discreetly near the front door, and during which the soft jazz, playing through the restaurant's speakers, felt increasingly surreal. Staff Sergeant Lynn Chartrand arrived in 8 minutes. She was a compact woman with grey eyes, and the expression of someone who had been interrupted at something important, and had been processing her feelings about it on the drive over. She came through the door, took in the room, located Kovacs, and crossed to him with the directness of a person who had been a cop for 22 years, and could read a situation in under 10 seconds. She looked at Kovacs, then at Mensah-Oduya, then at Tremblay-Nkosi. "Colonel," she said, with a professionalism that cost her something to maintain. "Thank you for calling. I apologize for." "Staff Sergeant, before you apologize, I want to make sure you have the full picture," Tremblay-Nkosi said pleasantly. "Captain Mensah-Oduya has been seated here for over 30 minutes. Multiple staff members can confirm his presence. Officer Kovacs entered the restaurant, bypassed your staff, crossed to this table, accused the captain of matching a suspect description that consists of black male in dark clothing, ignored the captain's clear and accurate assertion of his charter rights, and then unclipped his handcuffs and ordered him to stand up." She paused. "All of this was recorded by at least 5 phones in this room. I have also been recording since I walked in." She held up her own phone briefly. Chartrand's jaw tightened. She turned to Kovacs. "Badge," she said. Kovacs blinked. "Staff Sergeant, now Dale." The sound of a badge being unpinned from a uniform is not dramatic in the way movies suggest. It's small, a faint scratching of metal against fabric. But in a silent room, it carries. Kovacs set his badge in Chartrand's open palm. She closed her fingers around it. "You're on administrative leave, pending a professional standards review," she said. "I'll have someone drive your car back to the station. You're going to wait outside, and you're not going to speak to anyone in this room on your way out." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Go." He went. The walk across the dining room floor, the same floor he had crossed 20 minutes earlier, and his boots loud, was considerably different this time. He walked with his eyes down, and the room watched him go, and no one said anything until the heavy front door swung shut behind him. Then, from somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a single person started clapping, slowly, and then someone else joined, and within a few seconds the entire dining room was applauding, not loudly, not raucously. This was Auberge Champlain, after all, but with the particular warmth of a group of people who had witnessed something they would be describing at dinner parties for years. Tremblay and Nkosi sat down across from Mensah-Oduya. Henri appeared within 30 seconds with a second water glass and an expression of profound personal apology. The sommelier followed with a bottle of Burgundy that had not been ordered, presented with the compliments of the house. "Well," Tremblay and Nkosi said, unfolding her napkin, "that was not how I planned to begin this evening." "No," Mensah-Oduya agreed. He reached for the wine glass as it was filled, but it wasn't entirely surprising. She looked at him across the table. "It shouldn't be your reality." "No," he said again, quieter this time. "It shouldn't, but it is. The uniform is back in the closet, Bernadette. Without it, I'm a description on a radio dispatch." She held his gaze. "Not tonight. No, not tonight," they ordered. The conversation moved to his daughter, to the letter from RMC, to the particular look on her face when she opened it, to the question of whether she'd end up in signals like her father, or go the logistics route, the way her mother had always predicted. The evening settled back into something that resembled what it had been meant to be. But the professional standards process had already begun. The recording uploaded to social media by one of the diners had 17,000 views by midnight. By morning, it had 240,000. By the time the Ottawa Police Service's communications director sat down for his 9 a.m. briefing, the clip had been shared by 3 national journalists, 2 members of parliament, and the official social media account of the Department of National Defence, which had posted it with a single line: "We stand with Captain Mensah-Oduya." The investigation that followed was not, as these investigations sometimes are, a process designed primarily to produce the appearance of accountability while quietly protecting the officer involved. This was in part because Tremblay and Nkosi had submitted a 31-page written account of the incident within 18 hours, which she had copied to the Judge Advocate General's office, the independent police review director, and her own chain of command up to the rank of Brigadier General. It was also because the Professional Standards Unit assigned to the case, upon pulling Kovacs's file, found something that made the Auberge Champlain incident look less like an aberration and more like an inevitability. Over 9 years on the force, Dale Kovacs had accumulated 11 complaints. 6 of them involved allegations of racial profiling or discriminatory conduct. 4 had been dismissed during the union grievance process. 2 had resulted in formal reprimands that were subsequently reduced to letters of counsel after arbitration. None had resulted in any meaningful change to his conduct, because the complaints had come from people who lacked the resources, the connections, or the institutional standing to push back against a process that was structurally arranged to favour the officer. None of those people had been a decorated military officer with a colonel as their dinner guest and a JAG duty officer's phone number in their contacts. The Professional Standards Review, completed in 6 weeks, its findings were unambiguous. Kovacs had conducted a stop based on racial profiling without reasonable grounds, had ignored clear evidence refuting his stated suspicion, had failed to appropriately identify himself or explain the basis for the detention, and had escalated the encounter in a manner that demonstrated both poor judgment and a pattern consistent with prior complaints. The recommendation was termination. The Ottawa Police Services Board accepted the recommendation without a hearing. Kovacs was notified by registered mail. His union filed a grievance. The arbitration panel presented with the Professional Standards Report, the 11 prior complaints, the video evidence, and a written submission from the Judge Advocate General's office regarding the implications of his conduct under the National Defence Act. declined to reinstate him. The actual perpetrator of the Spark Street break and enter, it should be noted, had been apprehended 40 minutes after the dispatch call by a different officer working 2 blocks north. He was 19 years old. He was wearing a grey hoodie and green cargo pants. His name was, and this detail felt almost too pointed to be coincidental, Kyle Fenwick. He was white. The dispatch recording was clear. The 911 caller had described a teenager in a grey hoodie. There had been no mention of a suit, no mention of a restaurant. The description Kovacs had used to justify approaching Mensah-Oduya had not been a misinterpretation of the dispatch. It had been a fabrication, dressed in just enough procedural language to sound like police work. It wasn't police work, it was a choice. When the arbitration decision was issued and the termination made permanent, Mensah-Oduya was in Trenton, Ontario, preparing to brief a group of junior officers on post-deployment reintegration. He read the email on his phone during a break, standing in a hallway, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He didn't share it with the group. He finished the briefing, drove back to Ottawa, and told his daughter over dinner. She was 17, and she had followed the story closely since the night it happened. She had watched the video 9 times. She knew the complaint history. She had, in the weeks since, become somewhat intensely interested in military law, which her father thought was either a promising sign or a worrying one, depending on the day. "Is it over?" she asked. Mensah-Oduya thought about that for a moment. "For him," he said, "the case is over." She understood what he wasn't saying, that the larger thing, the pattern that had produced Kovacs, that had protected him for 9 years, that had made it so that every person who came before Mensah-Oduya in that file had been quietly absorbed by a system designed to outlast them. That wasn't over. That was a longer project with less satisfying timelines and fewer clear resolution points. But 11 complaints, 2 reprimands that became counsel letters, 6 years of complaints quietly buried. None of it had added up to accountability until one evening in October, when the wrong officer walked into the wrong restaurant and made the wrong assumption about the wrong man. Sometimes the system's failure to act becomes, in the end, the evidence that finally forces it to. Mensah-Oduya's daughter left for Kingston and RMC in September. She was, by every account, exceptional. She had her father's stillness and her mother's precision, and a particular quality that her instructors would eventually describe in performance reviews as composure under provocation, which was, everyone who knew the family agreed, perhaps the most Mensah-Oduya thing possible to be commended for. There is a version of this story that ends at the restaurant, with applause and a bottle of Burgundy and justice delivered in under an hour. That version is satisfying, it is also incomplete. The version that matters is the longer one. The one that asks how 11 complaints became nothing for 9 years, and what it means that it took a colonel and a JG submission and a video with 200,000 views to produce an outcome that should have been reached after complaint number 2. The version that asks how many people, before Mensah-Oduya, didn't have a colonel walking through the door, didn't have a 31-page written account filed within 18 hours, didn't have a network of institutional backing that made them impossible to ignore. Those people exist. Their names are in files that are still quietly closed. Accountability that only arrives when the victim has sufficient power to demand it is not justice. It is, at best, a very selective gravity, one that bends downward only when the weight is too much to ignore. Adisa Mensah-Oduya served Canada in places where he was asked to risk everything for principles that his country did not always extend to him when he came home and took off his uniform. He did not ask for what happened at Auberge Champlain. He asked only to eat dinner in peace and to accelerate his daughter's future. What he got instead was a reminder of how precarious that peace can be, and, on that particular evening, a reminder that precarity is not always the last word. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit like if you believe that accountability should not depend on rank or connections, and subscribe to Voices of Courage, because these stories, the ones that go deeper than a single headline, are the ones that actually change something.